Where's yours?
Thank you. I will go ahead and start sharing my screen. And everyone see that okay? I'll take silence as affirmative. So hi, everyone. My name is Jordan Hollinger. I'm an associate planner with the City of Flagstaff, and I will be talking today about equity and understanding equity in our community and as it relates to the regional plan as well. So this is actually our final snapshot webinar. So just a reminder for everyone, these are very brief 15-minute presentations, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. We're recording, so this will be posted to the City of Flagstaff YouTube channel. And we always say this is a draft. We welcome your comments and feedback on this. And all of these are intended to just be starting points for us as we go into the regional plan development. And then, as I mentioned, this is the last webinar. We will be trying to write papers over the next few months on all of the topics that we've covered throughout these. So that's the next step in these snapshot process. So what I'm going to be talking a little bit about today, I'm going to go over very briefly just some definitions of what equity is, some visual images of what equity is as well. I'll go through how we might understand equity in our community through data and indicators. I'll talk a little bit about equity in the regional plan and the planning process. And then just some notes of things to be curious about as we move forward. So I felt like I gave one disclaimer, but I felt like it was important to recognize that a 15-minute presentation is not sufficient for a full conversation on equity. It's such a big and complex topic and requires a lot of continued conversation, analysis, engagement, and reflection on our part. So what I'm going to go over today is just a very small piece of that overall conversation. I do think there's some useful stuff that I'll be covering today, especially when it comes to understanding how we can use data to understand equity, but it's by no means all-inclusive. This, for us, is just a first conversation of many when it comes to equity and the regional plan. So jumping into defining equity to the extent that we can, there are a lot of different definitions out there, and these are just two of them from organizations that sort of work in a similar space to us. So from Policy Link, which is a national research organization that's focused on equity, they define it as an equitable community is one where all residents, regardless of their race, nativity, gender, or zip code, are fully able to participate in the community's economic vitality, contribute to its readiness for the future, and connect to its assets and resources. From the American Planning Association's Equity Policy Guide, they say just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, unlocking the promise of the nation by unleashing the promise in us all. Another way to think about equity, especially for the visual learners out there, the image on the right that kind of shows the differentiation between equality and equity. Equity is inherently different from the concept of equality. Equality is really about treating everyone the same and giving everyone access to the same opportunities under the assumption that everyone will benefit from the same support and services. Equity is about recognizing that some groups are situated differently because of historical and current discrimination against them. Equity seeks to address those differences. So in other words, equality is about sameness, focusing on making sure everyone gets the same thing, while equity is about fairness, ensuring that each person gets what the person or population needs. So when we think about our context of the regional plan and sort of local government policy more generally, policies that aim to achieve equity or further equitable outcomes might result in unequal distribution of resources, but through that unequal distribution, it might actually lead to more equitable outcomes for everybody. In terms of how we understand equity in our community, I've taken some liberty here and broken the idea of understanding equity down into sort of two very general components, big blankets. The first, and the one I'll primarily be focusing on today, is data and indicators from more formalized sources of data, such as the Census Bureau and their American Community Survey, and those types of data sources. Data from places like the Census Bureau and their American Community Survey can help us understand where disparities exist across a fairly wide range of metrics and demographic characteristics. So, for example, sources like that can include fairly good data on things like income, health, education, access to certain resources, connectivity to certain resources. And then in many cases, we can look at those data points for disparities across demographic groups like race, ethnicity, gender, nativity, language, proficiency, age. I also included on the slide here physical ability and sexual orientation. Those are data points that are not as readily available in something like the ACS, but really important to consider as well. And then the second way to understand equity, which is equally, if not more important than the formalized data sources, is understanding the local lived experience through community and public engagement. Conversations, community engagement, and outreach can provide those insights into personal experiences, such as the barriers that people experience in terms of opportunities, people's experience with implicit and explicit bias. And community engagement can also help us explain the disparities that we see in more formalized data sources as well. So as I mentioned, my primary focus today is going to be on the sort of former aspect of understanding equity, so through data. And we currently live in a data-rich world. We are fortunate that there are organizations out there that are sort of pioneering the way we can use data for good. So one of the equity definitions I provided is from a research organization called PolicyLink, and they have developed this idea of an equity atlas. The atlas is a public-facing dashboard that provides data across a wide range of indicators and allows users to look at those indicators across a lot of different demographic variables. Their big push has been to what they call democratize data, making it really accessible and understandable to the public, trying to take the sort of that knowledge expertise away from experts and really putting it into the hands of the public. And the quantity of data points that they provide as part of their atlas idea is it's sort of representative of that multifaceted nature of equity. And the intention there is to try to get as full a picture, of a baseline picture as possible, and trying to include as many elements as possible in that baseline understanding. So the table here is representative of the indicators that the National Equity Atlas includes as part of their approach to equity. Many of the indicators here actually include a lot of different data points. So I think there are something like 30 different indicators here that they identify as part of their equity atlas. But within each one of those indicators, again, there are a lot of different data points. So, for us, this is probably one of the most robust approaches to evaluating and tracking equity within a community. And I think it demonstrates really well the complexity of and the various ways that we can see inequities within our community. And again, this isn't a complete evaluation of equity. They don't claim that either. There are certainly limitations such as data granularity for things like smaller geographic areas or intersections between 2 or 3, demographic groups. But this is certainly one of the most robust baseline sort of analyses that we're seeing today. And I've highlighted a few of these here that I'll cover in today's presentation for our community. So before I do that, before I go into some data, I want to offer some insights just about the limitations of these more formalized sources of data. So, just we're probably all aware of this, but data collection can be biased. and it can definitely miss important equity issues. So, at the end of the day, someone somewhere or groups of people are deciding what data we collect, how we're collecting it, and those processes can have bias to them. There are things that the American Community Survey does not ask about, doesn't collect data on, that we know disparities exist across those things that we're not collecting data on. One of the things we also know is that data collection from sources like the American Community Survey is that they can miss certain populations because of the way they collect data. So Indigenous groups have long held that these surveys undercount their population, who might be more itinerant or transient than other groups, kind of living part of the year in a place like Flagstaff and part of the year maybe in their home nation. So data can certainly miss those populations as well. And then quantitative data is not very good at explaining or revealing experiences. It's good at identifying the magnitude of disparities, but it's not necessarily good at identifying experiences, feelings, emotions, all of which are important, an important part of understanding the built and social environments that we're planning for. All right, so diving into the first indicator, which is related to wages and income. And just to mention, for each of these indicators and data points, I'll try to give a brief statement about why the indicator is important for understanding equity within our community. The statements are often centered on research about the impacts to opportunity that arise from inequities within the respective indicator. Some of the data that I'll show you is at the city level, and some of it is at the county level. So I have tried to include a note on each slide to indicate which it is for the indicator or data point that we're looking at. And I'll primarily look at 3 different demographic breakdowns across these data points. One is geographic, one is race and ethnicity, and then the final one is gender. So some data points I'll show all 3, and then some I'll just show 1 or 2. So why is income and wealth equity important? In an equitable economy, all workers would earn a living wage, and earnings would not vary systematically by race, ethnicity, gender, and geography. Low wages and pay gaps by race and gender undermine workers and their communities while reducing local spending and tax revenue. So first, let's take a look at how median income is distributed around our community. The map on the right here shows median household income by census tracts. And to me, the map is maybe a little difficult to glean a whole lot of insight from, in the sense that the census tract boundaries are designed to have a certain number of people, not necessarily correspond to our understanding of neighborhood boundaries locally. So this means that sometimes census tracts don't do a great job of showing geographic disparities that exist, which may be the case here as we have sort of deeper insights about our community. A few points to highlight is that we can see places like Sunnyside, Southside, the area around NAU do seem to have lower median incomes than areas like Fort Valley, Donny Park, Ponderosa Trails, Cheshire area. One of the interesting things that I think you see on this map is that the census tract that includes Pine Canyon, which we sort of know to be a wealthier area, actually has a lower median income. And I don't really have a good answer as to what's going on there or why that is. Again, one of the difficulties in using these types of geographies for analysis. And one of the reasons it's important to examine indicators like this across geographic areas is that there's good research out there to suggest that a mix of things like incomes and educational attainment within community areas is actually better for the long-term outcomes of lower income community members. And sort of vice versa, is that when you have less distribution of income and educational attainment and sort of higher concentrations of similar people, higher concentrations of people, lower income people maybe living in a particular area, that can be slightly worse for long-term outcomes. So moving on to income by race and ethnicity, the graph here shows pretty clearly that households that have a white head of household member have significantly higher median income than all other groups. The difference, depending on which group you're comparing against, is in the range of $10,000 to $30,000 more $1,000 more per year. few notes here. The other race category, I put an orange box around that there, and I just wanted to call out that there was a very large error associated with that estimate, which is something that the Census Bureau develops as part of their estimates, and it just indicates that there's a lot of I wouldn't look at that estimate and think that it's overly reliable. That's essentially what they're saying when they identify something with a very high level of error. There also wasn't enough data for a Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander category here, so that actually there's the Census Bureau actually didn't have a data point for that grouping, so that's not included here either. And what we see here certainly follows national trends when it comes to wealth and income, that we generally see white households doing better on the income levels than other groups.
Good.
Mark, your
okay.
your mic is on. Do you mind turning that off? Thanks. So looking at median earnings by gender, we can see, again, like national trends, we have a gender pay gap of about $3,000 to $4,000 per year in Flagstaff. So income inequality is our next indicator, and I just have one slide here that includes sort of two similar ways to understand income inequality. The first is the Gini coefficient, which is in the table on the bottom here. The measure can have a value from 0 to 1, and it measures the income distribution across a population. And just kind of at a high level, an index value of 0 indicates a population where there is perfect equality and everyone has an equal income share, while 1 would indicate perfect inequality, or one person holding all the wealth. So the state of Arizona, Coconino County, and Flagstaff all have a Gini coefficient of around 0.46. Which is slightly lower than the US average of 0.48, indicating that income is slightly more equitably distributed in our region when we compare it to the nation as a whole. The figure on the right shows the 20th and 95th income percentile values, and then I've added a ratio between the two. So the idea here is that the higher the ratio, the worse the income inequality. And we can see that over the last 20 years, income inequality, again, following national trends, has gotten slightly worse here, meaning that we have more or fewer people holding more of the wealth over time in our community. So why does this matter? Inequality in income really undermines economic opportunity and prosperity. Inequality not only harms those at the bottom of the income spectrum, but it's actually bad for everybody. Studies do find that income inequality depresses economic growth by limiting educational opportunities for low-income children, decreasing individual income, harming wealth and well-being, health and well-being, and spurring excessive debt. On the other hand, greater economic inclusion, better income equality leads to more robust and sustained growth. So the next indicator is child poverty, and I have just this one slide again by geography on this. And here we can see, similar to the income map, that child poverty is higher in certain areas of the region than others. We see again in the sort of sunny side, south side neighborhoods, a higher rate of child poverty than areas like Ponderosa Trails, Cheshire, Fort Valley. So, you know, it probably doesn't need explaining, but child poverty is really important. Lack of sufficient income has a lot of negative consequences on health, well-being, and economic success. So children who experience poverty are at greater risk of starting school behind their peers, scoring lower on achievement tests, being unemployed, earning less as adults, having poor health as adults. And estimate that's out there is that child poverty alone costs an estimated $1 trillion per year to the US economy due to lower economic productivity and increased costs of healthcare and other social services. So looking at unemployment, in an equitable economy, everyone who wants to work would have a good job. Here we're looking at unemployment rates by race and ethnicity. We see that on the low side of unemployment are white, Asian, and Native American populations. On the high side, Black and mixed race and Hispanic, Latino populations. One of the things I wanted to note here is that since these are 5-year estimates from the American Community Survey, that we now have the time period that would include the first part of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in terms of the numbers that you're seeing here, it's not just focused on 2020, but there would be some level of impact that you would see in the data here that's related to the first part of the COVID-19 pandemic. And unemployment is an important equity consideration. Again, probably not a whole lot of explanation needed here, but employment is the predominant source of income for the vast majority of working age people. And unemployment is strongly associated with poverty, as well as physical and mental illness, drug addiction, and suicide. So ensuring true full employment in our community would reduce racial inequalities and poverty while boosting workers' bargaining power and creating a stronger economy. So then just one final note on this is that when we look at unemployment numbers, the way that this is defined is by people that are actively that are looking for work. So what this isn't necessarily showing is people that have fallen out of the employment market due to a variety of reasons. Things like drug addiction, mental illness can be a part of that. Just feeling dejected by the employment process can be another reason for that. So this isn't necessarily including that. So maybe a simplistic look at unemployment as well here. All right, so on to education. Education is an important equity consideration. It's key to building a strong workforce ready for the jobs of tomorrow and the future. And generally speaking, future jobs will require higher levels of skill and education. But our education and workforce systems have often not adequately prepared, particularly low-income people and people of color, to succeed in our knowledge-driven economy. So we're going to start out looking at the geographic distribution of educational attainment. So this data was actually available at the census block group level, and you can see here this does a little better in terms of granularity than the other maps. And this is one of the things that's difficult about census data, is that because of some of their rules about data privacy, sometimes we can't get really granular with that data. This is one area that I was able to get a little bit more granular with the data and to show things at a slightly smaller level. So this is the population 25 or older with at least a bachelor's degree. And we can still see some trend here with areas that have lower educational attainment corresponding to some of those lower income areas that we saw earlier, as well as the child poverty. So we're starting to see that there are some consistencies across these various maps in terms of the geographic distribution of indicators that are related to opportunity in life. Looking at educational attainment across race and ethnicity, we can see here clearly that white and Asian populations have higher rates of higher education. That's the orange section of the bar, and then lower rates of incompletion for high school as well. Within the city of Flagstaff, education doesn't differ a lot by gender, but we are starting to see higher rates of educational attainment among women than men. And this does follow national trends with college enrollment over the last 10 years or so. Women have made up a larger share of yearly enrollment, and that's also very much the case at NAU here as well. So we do see a slightly higher rate of bachelor's degrees among women in Flagstaff than men. We also know that disparities often exist across numerous demographic intersections. So a lot of what I've shown has been across just one. So looking at race or looking at gender, looking at geography, just one. But that can, where we actually see disparities can actually happen across 2, 3, 4 different demographic variables. So for example, here we're looking at education across race and gender, and we can start to see some additional differences. So for example, when we look at the share, again, this is the orange bar, people with a bachelor's degree or higher, we can see that Black and Native American women are obtaining degrees at lower rates than other groups. And that's really important to identify that those intersections between different groupings, that we see real disparities amongst those sort of more granular levels of demographic groupings. Moving on to vehicle access, which is another key indicator. We live in a community that is quite heavily car dependent. If you're familiar with the organization Walk Score, which produces community ratings for walkability, bikeability, and transit, that organization gives us relatively modest ratings on each of those three things that I put on the bottom here. We certainly aren't the worst community for getting around by bike, pedestrian modes, or transit, but we are very much a car dependent city in many respects. So access to reliable and affordable transportation is really critical for meeting the daily needs and accessing things like educational opportunities, employment opportunities that are located and distributed throughout our region. So the graph on the right here is actually for the county, and it shows that households headed by people of color are overall less likely than white households to have access to a vehicle. And just to note on the groupings here, this data, although it does come from the ACS, the American Community Survey, it was additionally aggregated and analyzed by PolicyLink, which makes the National Equity Atlas. And they made some decisions here in terms of the data groupings, and I thought it was pretty revealing as well to look at the data in this way. So I decided to keep it that way. So next is home, looking at housing and home ownership. This slide is looking at home ownership by race and ethnicity. And home ownership is and can be a critical pathway to economic security and mobility. Owning a home can help lower income people build an asset that can be used to pay for education and other productive investments. We know that for the white population, home ownership has been a store of wealth for a lot longer than it has been for communities of color. The ability of home ownership to foster economic mobility can depend on access to affordable, sustainable mortgage financing, as well as the amount of home appreciation, both of which are affected by discriminatory lending practices and racial segregation that are still holdovers from more explicit policies around those things. So again, here, this data is from the National Equity Atlas for the county, and we can see that the white population has a higher rate of home ownership than Latino and people of color. The Native American population also has a relatively high rate of home ownership within the county as well. In addition to just looking at home ownership, being housing cost burdened is also an important consideration, and that's defined as spending more than 30% of income on housing. Housing is the single largest expense for a lot of households, and a lot of households pay too much for housing, particularly low-income renters. So high housing costs can squeeze family budgets, and that can leave fewer resources to pay for other expenses and other opportunities that might benefit them in the long term. So we can see here, I think one of the most revealing things about the graph on the right is that across the board, there's a high level of housing cost burden in our region. And this is actually something that the 10-year housing plan that was recently adopted by the city actually took a look at as well and found the same thing. And really this is driven by the fact that incomes in Flagstaff are disproportionately low when it comes to when compared to housing costs, resulting in a very high rate of housing being housing cost burden. And we can see certainly here that that housing cost burden is significantly higher among renters than owners. So that's it in terms of the data that I'm going over. And again, that was just a very small and quick overview of just a few data points. So I want to talk next about how that data can be used in decision making as well. So part of using the data is being able to identify community needs based on those individual data points. We can look geographically at something like child poverty and identify areas where we might need additional resources for children. But I think also important is that tracking this type of data over time can help determine whether inequities are improving, getting worse, and also inform policy direction as well. I think that's really important to note, that we want to understand how these things are changing over time, especially when we're developing policies that might address these. So that's one of the things that we need to consider for the future regional plan, is how can we use this type of data to evaluate the effectiveness and equity implications of policies that we're setting in the regional plan. And then another interesting way that communities have started to use this type of data is actually to combine multiple data points into one measure that identifies a particular community group or need. These are called index or composite measures, and they are just measures that you can sort of customize to identify particular needs that are localized to your community. And I do have an example of this. So Mountain Lion actually developed an equity index for their transit service area. This is something that they've done in the last year or so. That is what the equity index is, a map, and that's what I'm showing on the right-hand side here. The index was developed to help identify where mobility challenged populations are located and understand gaps in service to underrepresented populations as well. So the index is comprised of data around income, minority populations, disabled populations, populations with limited English language proficiency, older senior populations, youth, and then zero car households. So they combine all of those measures into one to take a look at how their service is addressing those needs. So they're now using this index and this map to inform decisions about their transit service upgrades, as well as changes and investments into their transit infrastructure. So when you have something like this, so for Mountain Lion, this isn't the only thing that they're considering in their decision-making process, but the idea is that to add something like this into the mix of factors is a good way to start ensuring that they're developing a more equitable route system. So wrapping up with the regional plan and how this is all related, when it comes to planning and local policy, inequity is kind of marked by two key attributes. One is disproportionality, which is when the outcomes of a project or plan create or amplify disparities in only part of a community. The disproportionate impacts can lead to further social and economic impairment of some groups, while others receive the full benefit of the effort. So we need to think about how the impact of the regional plan, especially the goals and policies, what the distributive effects of the plan is. And then the second part is institutionalized, which is the idea that inequity is often embedded in the methodologies that we use. And through those methodologies, they are almost justifying systemic inequities, policies that ignore negative outcomes and those disproportionate impacts. So we really need to take a look at the methodologies that we're using and understand where there might be bias in those institutionalized processes as well. As we go into the development of the regional plan, it's important to consider whether and how we are developing the plan with equitable engagement. We need to ask the question, do we have all voices at the table? And are we engaging those voices in the right ways? Is our methodology inclusive of people with varying abilities? Those are the sorts of questions we need to be asking. In terms of what's in the plan, the goals and policies really need to consider equity implications in both their development and implementation. So are we setting goals and policies that reflect that first idea of equitable input in the process? Do we know what the distributive benefits of the goals and policies are if we're creating policies for certain infrastructure improvements? Do we know how those benefits are being distributed to the community as a whole? And then finally, how are we tracking the outcomes of goals and policies with an equity lens? Again, kind of getting into that distribution and the idea from the last slide about disproportionality. Are we actually making inequities worse? Are we making them better? Does it have no impact? Should it have impact? Those are kind of the questions we should be asking. And then I think it's important to consider whether the regional plan is the right place to identify and develop goals and policies that seek to explicitly improve equity in our community and what that might look like. And of course, there is a lot more to be curious about. I've even, with my 30-minute version of a 15-minute presentation, I have barely scratched the surface on this topic. So there are a lot of prominent equity issues that look at things like gentrification and displacement. That is an issue here. Environmental justice and climate change is a really, sorry, pun not intended, but hot topic in the sense that climate change is leading to a lot of localized heat islands in a lot of cities. And that is often disproportionately felt by lower income communities and communities of color. Community engagement and empowerment in the decision-making process. And then some of these other things I've talked about already in terms of how we can include goals and recommendations that would advance equitable outcomes, what that might look like. Do we have any evidence of what that might look like in the context of a regional plan? So a lot of further conversations to be had, a lot more data to explore, a lot more conversation to be had on the topic of equity. So that is all I have. So thank you for listening. I will stop sharing and open it up to questions. And sorry for going over. Big topic.
Saying none, I'll jump in.
All right, sounds good, Nat.
First of all, wonderful data-filled talk and
Thanks.
very well presented. Really appreciate that. One comment on your Pine Canyon area there.
Yeah.
It's probably just a misnomer to call it Pine Canyon because that includes the first development in Flagstaff, Bow and Arrow, which has a lot of rental housing. And then also in that, there are now some student apartment housing. And then beyond that, on the other side is a county island. So I think that probably dominates the Pine Canyon and skews the statistics. That's one thing. Another thing is, I'd reverse your comment about the comparison of home ownership and rental and income disparity. I think rental rates are significantly higher than our income rates. In other words, if you look at it, it looks like it's a lot less expensive if you can get the down payment to own a house. And the difference between owning a house and rental property is both the bank or the individual owners that own rental properties.
Yeah, and I think maybe I misspoke or something. So that when I was showing that slide about you're talking about the housing cost burdened.
Yes.
So it is actually the case that our renters are much more house cost burdened than our owners.
Yes, you said that, but the way it was, the way I look at it is, and I think everybody else looks at it is, many people look at it as the rent is higher than the cost of owning a house if you can get the down payment.
Sure.
Because the rent is
even more disproportionate to income.
It's driven by a whole different market. it's individual people that own rentals, it's corporations that own rentals, it's small companies that own rentals, and they will go where the market will bear in a way that I think disproportionately hits the lower income people
Yes.
than the whole the ownership
Mhm.
housing market.
I think
So-
that's a really important point too, that there are, well, I think, so there's an organization company called AirDNA that keeps data on like short-term rentals in our community, and that's taking something like 2,000 something in that ballpark full units out of the either ownership or rental market. So I think if you were to look at it without that, considering that impact, I think you would see the numbers actually even higher for renters in terms of how many are housing cost burdened. And I think your point about looking at it even more by income level, and I'm trying to remember the conversations that I've had with our housing department, but I believe it is the case that the lower income community members are disproportionately housing cost burdened as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And then one last thing, I know Sat has his hand up too. With a well-known organization in discussing their mission, the discussion was between using the word social justice or equity. And the argument I was trying to make is equity is the basis of social justice. You don't get social justice by working backwards. So what's your comment on all of this between the terms social justice and equity? How are they connected?
That is a really good question, and I'd probably have to give it some additional thought. I am by no means an expert on this. I'm giving this presentation because I am an expert on data. I think there's an element that I would agree with, that you to achieve. Well, you know what? I'm not sure. I think I need to give that some additional thought. So you'll forgive me for bailing out of that question.
No, well, thank you. Yeah, that was probably out in left field, I guess, maybe a question, but
that's okay. We're receptive to left field questions too. We just might not answer them.
But and you handle it well. To me, equity is the base. If you got equity, then you can work towards social justice. If you don't have equity, then it just doesn't seem like it just seems like you're taking things piecemeal. But
sure,
I'm done. Thank you.
All right. Yep. Thanks, Nat. All right, Sat.
Thank you. Great presentation, kind of mind-bending. I don't think we had this conversation very much when we did the last regional plan. As far as equity and social justice, I think equity is a calmer, less political way to say probably the same thing, and therefore a better way to say it. I think more people would, from more parts of the political spectrum, would be comfortable with equity versus social justice. And I'm just trying to get my head around how we would apply this concept to the regional plan process. There's certain things that are obvious.
Mm-hmm.
Housing. We don't really get into the minimum wage. We do get into job development, employment to some degree. We don't really get into education, which is absolutely critical. So it seems that we generally would do our normal job, but we need a brain like yours to explain the implications as we go forward in each subject, because obviously the regional plan is complex document with lots of goals and lots of policies. And so I think maybe a statement as part of the plan and then ongoing analysis would make the most sense. Just trying to get my head around how to influence the plan with the perspective that you have just laid out very well.
Yeah, and I think so. Really good questions, and I think the answer is sort of more questions. One of the things that we I think one of the best things that we can do is just stay open to those conversations throughout the process, but also go into it by asking each group that we meet with, that we talk with, to give us questions that we should be asking, because we don't pretend to know, if, from the city's side of things, we are a comprehensive planning team of 3. And although we're well trained and have some level of expertise, we don't pretend to even know all of the right questions to ask. So I think that's part of it too, is that we are trying to go into this process being open to change and adaptation in our process, and leaving it open to kind of being prodded with additional questions and saying, hey, have you thought about this? From the data side of things, we kind of know what our data sources are. We have a generally good sense of where they're not very good at identifying inequities. We, as I think said during the presentation, because we're in a data rich and research rich world, we have a pretty good idea of how certain indicators would be related to certain goals and policies, definitely not all of them. And then it becomes, I think, as you said, about developing the capacity to track that data in a really usable way over time as some of the goals and policies are both developed and then implemented as well. So that's kind of an answer, non-answer, in the sense that, it's just going to involve us continuing to ask questions and remaining curious about and open to new thoughts about where inequities exists, how something might affect equity in our community.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. One of the, I think about culture a lot, how we evolved as social animals. We develop distinct cultures within groups, and it's hard, not because you're a bad person, just because we are social animals, to appreciate the culture to appreciate other cultures. And so to simply ask people, make sure we're talking to every group, is really important, because we can't necessarily assume that we see the world the way other people do.
That's right.
And there may be small tweaks that would make a big difference to groups that are now underserved or at the low end of the equity spectrum. So just talking to everybody, I think, as you say, is a great idea.
Thanks, Sad. And I think Sarah wants to pause the recording because we're going way over here.
Yeah, hi everyone. We're way over time, and unfortunately everybody has to get a little break and run to another meeting in about 10 minutes. So I'm going to end the recording.